Welcome to the DeviceDojo. I'm Joseph, as you might know by now, and this is where we tackle the practical side of securing connected devices, from over-the-air updates and fleet management to the broader challenges like incident detection and response, compliance, encryption, and more. Always actionable and hands-on, and brought to you by Northern Tech, the makers of Mendrayo. Let's get started. Hopefully people are awake, as they usually are at this point in time. So, what are we going to talk about today? Read-only file systems. Why are we doing this? It's the point of the DeviceDojo, presented by Northern Tech. I am Joseph. I'm developer enablement expert, and I focus on giving actionable technical content that makes or that helps you make your connected devices more secure. I do this usually. This is the main series as a form of tutorials, but we've already had one live show. I plan to do live coding in the office hours at some point in time too. It really depends a little bit on how interaction and people do show up. Next slide means, so what are we talking about today and in which form? This specific session has grown a very weird history up to this point in time, and I want to share it with you. And then we'll talk about what read-only is and what it actually means. Then a little bit on how we make stuff read-only in a very practical way. Proceeding further to dynamic read-only. This is a technique that I have successfully used in the past. So this is my personal trick, I would say, that I want to share here. Then, of course, we're going to blow up some things in the demo, and hopefully you can take away something in the end. The history of this session. Last month, about the same time, I told, hey, the next session will be on read-only file systems. And for whatever reason, a good friend of mine, who's a regular on this show, usually shows up during the show and means like, for whatever reason, you always talk about the stuff that just relates to my project. So I announce I'm going to talk about read-only file systems. And he's just like, well, strange that you're talking about that. Just a couple of hours later, literally. So what happens? One of my main sources of inspiration and content also has shown up here a couple of times already. Has a Yaskla. I'm pretty sure I pronounce it wrong and a different way every time, but check out his stuff. Writes an excellent article on read-only file systems with Yocto. Right in that month between my announcement and today. So basically all of the important stuff is already there. And then another week later, somebody whom I might know shows up on the Yocto project mailing list and is like, yeah, so now I've got this read-only file system project, and for partitioning reasons, I need to take care of this and this and that. How do I do this? Read the linked thread here. So essentially, you have SS article, and you have the thread here, which outlines a couple of other small nitpicks, and then you're set. So why should you listen to me? Good question. There's a couple of things you should understand, if you ask me, and they are about why read-only actually and what it really means, and how you can take things a little bit further. What I'm talking about here today basically is meant to augment the resources that already exist, because repeating is not a lot of fun. So why read-only? Yes, it is about data integrity at some point in time, but not in terms of unintentionally altering it. Because if you're writing, then you want to alter something. So this is intended use, planned use, I would say. The problem with writing to a file system is that it almost always is a destructive operation. It's not like, hey, you've got your storage thing there, and I just want to write these 10 bytes at this location, and then it happens, and all of the rest of the file system goes untouched. Usually it means you modify a file, so you have to read a block back, modify it, write the full block. Or if it is a copy on write file system, then it gets written to a new block, for example. Then all of the metadata, so which block belongs to which file, has to be updated. This happens under the hood. You don't see it. And it can also happen if you are not aware of it. If the system decides, hey, now is a really good time to write something like logging, like debugging or core dumps, or whatever things happen under the hood, unless you actively prohibit them. The problem here is that for a connected device, you often have unstable conditions. And whatever you do, a failed write operation can, under whatever circumstances, corrupt your file system. Not just the one file that you wrote. Depending on where the error happens, it actually can have catastrophic results for the full file system. Some file systems are more resilient to this than others, and there's ways to like strip things down. But whenever you write something and something goes wrong at a very bad point in time, then you've got a problem. As I said, you can strip things down a little bit by the two common approaches. One is journaling. So instead of just writing and modifying the full file system, you first write a journal which tells you, hey, what you want to write later. And then you actually write to the file system. Because if now something goes wrong, you return to this state, you look at the journal and say, hey, I was in the process of doing this and this and that, but obviously something went wrong, so I have to pick up here and clean. So this already helps you. And then there's copy on write, which means instead of modifying and possibly breaking an existing piece of data, old data is always kept on the storage, and new modified data is only written to areas which are at the moment marked as free. So if something at writing goes wrong, you can just say, okay, I'm going to stick with the old state. Again, none of these are bulletproof, if you ask me. But if you think you absolutely need a writable file system, then make sure techniques like these are enabled. The key point about read-only file systems is that this is only software. You have to let this sink in a little bit. Storage on the hardware level is almost never read-only. There are things like the ROM flash on your microcontroller, which is relatively close to it because it is raw flash. There is no management happening there usually, and you do not unintentionally trigger the routines to modify it in your firmware application. So that is pretty close already, but technically it could still be written. If we're looking at higher operating systems like Linux, then the storage is almost never read-only. One thing it has, it's a little bit blast from the past, but you might remember the CFI. It's a common flash interface, also for dealing with raw NAND, and that one has a read-write line. So an obvious thing might be like, hey, of course, I'm going to strip this this wire jumper or whatever, so nobody can write to the flash anymore. Yeah, it turns out it actually doesn't work that way, because the flash needs to toggle this line actually for issuing commands to the flash. So, sorry, bad luck, no read-only for you again. Same for SD cards or MMCs. They've got a switch for setting read-only. The problem is that switch doesn't do anything. That switch is just a little plastic thingy, and it's actually evaluated by a contact on the board. And if the software decides to ignore that contact on the board, or if that pin isn't even there anymore, like for micro SD cards, well then feel free, write to the storage. So for almost all modern storage that you are using, the decision to be read-only is purely in software. If the hardware decides to go bonkers, well, you're out of luck. And this can happen because modern storage technology needs refreshes under the hood. So if you look at modern storage, especially SSDs, there are controller chips in there who make sure that your flash does the wear leveling if a cell goes bad or runs out of storage, because reading from a cell actually is pulling data, pulling electrical loads out of it, and then it has to be refreshed, blah, 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 blah. A lot of magic going on there. Blocks go bad. All of these things happen. So this happens even if you are not actively writing anything. So it makes your chances of losing data smaller. But even if you try everything, then at a very bad point in time, if power fails or gives you spikes or whatever, you might crash your storage. I've never seen anybody who could prove that it does not happen or cannot happen for their devices. You can just make the chance smaller. So why do we actually do all of this if the hardware works against us? Well, as I said, you still have to make the chance smaller. Now we're overlapping a little bit with ESA, because, I'm usually talking about Yocto, and Yocto actually has a very neat trick or define or prepared magic for going read-only, because you just said image features, read-only root file system. That's it. No more magic required. We can end here. Yes and no. Read-only root file system means that whatever you have constructed as your root file system is adjusted such that it is read-only by default. So it is mounted as read-only by default, and all of the data or all of the directories where the system usually needs to write to unconditionally are moved into tempfs. That's okay. But still, if somebody wants to still write to this file system, they can still do it. They just have to remount. There are file systems which explicitly do not even support writing. So if you really care about being read-only, then I suggest to go for squashfs or its successor erofs, because it doesn't even allow doing something to it during runtime. So that's another barrier. If somebody of you is old enough to still remember compact discs, yes, ISO 9660 actually is a file system too, which is on compact discs, and the chance to write there is pretty small. As I said, stuff that is volatile, like system logs, go to tempfs, and then we're good, right? The system works again. The problem is that every non-trivial device actually still needs to store stuff somewhere. So where do you do it? You don't have a root file system, which you can write to, so you need an additional partition. This is a very simple example for Yocto, for a WKS file, where after the root file system, you add a writable partition. I've chosen 265 max here, but it really doesn't matter. Just make sure it is large enough. And then on this writable partition, you can have symlinks pointing to it from the root file system, or you can use bind mounts to overlay specific directories, or in the really worst case, you use an overlay FS. I strongly advise against using overlay FSs, but I want to mention them here because many people think they're a good idea. Not me. An example on how to create such root file system or build with Yocto is, yes, this is an image recipe. You set the image feature. You said, yes, I want a WIC and not just the file system image like X4. You point the build to your most beloved WKS file. And then one thing that is easily missed, you need mount points, because Yocto will create the FS tab entries, but it will not make sure that the mount points actually exist. How could it? So if you want to mount to non-file system hierarchy standard-ish locations from your FS tab, then you need to make sure that the actual mount points exist. And the common way to do this is a post-processing command in the root file system. Now I told you I want to make the chances of error during writing smaller. What I just showed you is we've got a root file system, which is hopefully safe, but now we've got a writable partition for our customer data or device data. And now that is writable again, so there's only a little gain. How about we make that one read-only too? And that's the stuff that I've done in the past. The trick here is, in an embedded application environment, you usually know when and what you write because you control the application, right? If you use some magic frameworks or just pull in random stuff, well, maybe not so much. But for a classical embedded device, you know, hey, now my application needs to configure something because it happens through the UI or through the web interface. And then you can say, hey, when I start this configuration process, the partition where all of my possibly mutable data is, which is mounted as read-only by default, just before I start writing to it, I remount it to read-write. I do my writes, and when I did the remount, I fire off a small timer, which like 5 seconds, 10 seconds. It depends a little bit on your use case. And as long as that timer is still running, the partition stays in read-write mode. And once the timer is elapsed, you mount back to read-only. Why that timer and not just wrapping? If you're wrapping, then you end up with if you're doing something threads, you might end up with a lock. Or if your user is doing a number of configuration things in one go, which they usually do. So you open a settings page, you change this setting and this setting and this setting and this setting, and then you're done. So if you do remounts all of the time, you end up with a lot of expensive operations. The trick here, as I said, is the cooldown timer. If you've got only one write, hey, no magic happens. Remount, write, remount back. If you've got multiple remounts, multiple writes, you remount, you do the first write. And the next write just checks, hey, is it already writable? If so, yes, awesome. Just rearm the timer, do another write, and another one, and another one, until the timer finally elapsed. So you can do all of your desired write processes in one go with only one remount at the beginning, one remount at the end. And like I said, this is stuff that I've done in the past, and it has served me really well. The grace period avoids the repetitive remounting, and the optimization, as opposed to the demo that I have prepared, is you could put this into a separate process, into a singleton in your file system somewhere. It depends on the actual construction of your application. That has to be said. And if the system is overly complex, it might not work for you. But as I said, at least think about it. And with that, it's demo time. Remove this and give me that thing. So what do I have here? This is, as I claimed, the root file system, erofs, read only. My data partition is also read only, just for the sake of demonstration of a thing that is symlinked. The host name, for example, if we look at etc hostname, then it actually points to data etc hostname. If we look at data etc, then, well, there's hostname, and we could change it by the same dance, essentially. And I've got the demo application, which I hopefully can fire sensibly enough. So let's say just one write. The interval doesn't make a lot of sense for one write, and grace period 5 seconds are good enough. So it starts off. It remounts. We can see the demask interleaved here. It's rewrite. It wrote something. The timer expires and it remounts back. Let's look at data. Here we go. So now, if we do like 4 writes with the grace within the grace period, you see there's one remount. It writes. It writes. It writes again, and it writes one more time. So the user is just clicking through the configuration interface, and then it remounts only one time in the end. This requires a little bit of tuning. Maybe you might want to go for a minute or for 2 in the timer, but for demonstration purposes, well, this is obviously working. What does this require in the image? This is based off core image minimal, as already showed. Read-only file system, referring to the WIC. The mount point. And this is the moving of hostname to the data partition. I think there was one other thing which I wanted to highlight. Yes, erofs, for example, is not enabled by default in the Yocto kernels. So if you go for this, watch out for the file system actually being supported. And we can take a small look at the demo application, although it's more for reference here. Here's the actual timer logic. Writable, remount, true. If it goes through it, it writes, and at the timer, if the timer fires, it is up here. Remount data. then it should fire. Where is it? I don't get it at the moment. Yeah. So much for my thinking along the lines of how to deal with your read-only file systems. What you should take away from here. Make everything read-only that you can. And as long as you can. Try to not say, hey, this can be written all the time. This can't be written. Try to make everything as long as possible and use dynamic remounts. When you're doing the switch to a read-only file system and you haven't done it early in your project, you might run into a lot of errors of applications not working anymore because you have always implicitly expected that they can just do as they please. So instead of being annoyed about the errors, really take this as a chance to think about what is writing where and how to deal with it, and to find out things that are doing activities which you actually did not expect to happen. Really, take it as a chance and not as an annoyance. My personal opinion is that if you are going for an overlay FS, just catch all of this in the mutable additional file system because you can, and it seems to work right away. It essentially means that you're giving in, then you have no clue what's going on. You just say, I want a read-only file system. I have no idea what's writing there all the time. Let's make it work and hope for the best. That's what an overlay FS is to me. I've never used one in production. Where can you read and learn more on this? As already said, Esa's article is excellent. I've linked it here one more time. Please head over, read it, and understand how things do work in Yocto in more depth. This demo and explanatory code will be on the Mender Hub in the very, very near future. At the moment, this is just a placeholder link, and whatever I talked about today goes in there during the remainder of today. So you can also exercise this for yourself. And the next session is probably on June 11th. I don't know perfectly yet because of timing and reasons and personal things. And I'm not sure what I really want to talk about. If you've got an interesting topic, please shoot it my way. Otherwise, after doing a little bit of Linux, it's time to do something on MCUs again. Maybe diving deeper into storage forms that are relevant on MCUs, EEPROMs, SPI, attached storage. I guess if nothing else or the inspiration doesn't bite me real quick, then it will be something like that. With that, that's it for today's DeviceDojo. Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss the next session, and drop a comment below. Whether you've got questions about what we covered today, ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. If you're ready to implement professional OTA updates in your own projects, check out Mender.io. All of the links are in the description, and see you in the next episode.